Hello. I'm so glad to be with you all again and to be able to spend a little bit of time in the Word with you today. Our New Testament passage is Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. And really, this passage is about light and dark. But it's about more than just contrasting the light and the dark. It's about taking the fight to the powers of darkness. God taking the fight to the powers of darkness. And that includes both the powers of darkness within us, the things that we seek to hide, our sin, those dark parts of ourself, but also the powers of darkness that are outside of us. So how do we do this? Because if willpower alone was enough to overcome our personal demons or to overthrow the powers and principalities of our world, wouldn't we have already done this? Well, I think verse 8 holds the key for us because verse 8 tells us, "Now in the Lord you are light." Christ's light is the spiritual energy we need in our struggle against the forces of evil. And here's the amazing thing that we learn later in verses 13 through 14, that God's light both reveals and renews. And what that means is that God's light doesn't only expose what's in the dark, but it changes the darkness into what the light is. It changes into light what it exposes. And the light that we're talking about here is the risen Christ. Now, during this time of Lent, during this time of social isolation that a lot of us are experiencing because of the pandemic, we may feel as if we are sitting in the dark. But we know that the light of the resurrection is coming. The same way that as we sit in the dark of night, we know that the sun will rise again. It hasn't happened yet, maybe, but we know that it's coming because it always does. So this light that we know that is coming, this light that is the risen Christ, it's a light that exposes. And that means that we have to be willing to let it expose us, expose our darkness, expose our complicity with the darkness. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, how are we complicit with the darkness? I mean, I do the right things. But often we become complicit with the darkness by not actively bringing the light to it. Often we participate in darkness by doing nothing in response to it. You see, we may not be causing the darkness, but we're not stopping it either. I wonder what ways we could examine how we might not be causing darkness, but we're also not stopping it. I wonder, too, how this passage calls us to examine the darkness within us and be willing to expose it to the light of Christ. To be able to hold it to Jesus and say, "Here, God, shine your light on this." And that is a really scary and difficult thing to do. But I think it's what we have to do. Because until we can allow God to expose the darkness in us, I don't know that we can ask God to help us expose the darkness outside of us. But here's the good news in all of this. This passage in Ephesians is bookended with grace. The beginning starts with grace, the end ends with grace. And in between, it calls us to do our part in doing away with darkness. And our part, again, that's the bringing the darkness within us to God and allowing God to shine light on it, but then also going out and being ready to do battle with the forces of darkness in this world, with the powers and principalities that seek to put out the light of Christ. But on either end of that is this grace that God calls us to accept. That the light really doesn't come from us. You see, we have to do our part, right? We have to be willing to let the light expose us. We have to be willing to then go be light, because grace without discipleship is cheap grace. Dietrich Bonhoeffer tells us that. But we need to first accept the grace that the light doesn't come from us. It doesn't originate within us. You see, in Advent, we celebrate the light of the world coming to us in the baby Jesus. And the great thing about that is that the light comes to us. It's not an act of us, but an act of God. God brings the light to us. And I feel like in Lent, sometimes we feel this darkness creeping in again. We see the darkness apparently overtake Jesus and his death. And yet, once again, God brings the light to us through Jesus' resurrection. And then God chooses us to be the light. And how do we do this? By discerning what is true and good and right. That's what Ephesians tells us. However, I think it's really important for us to make the distinction between being moralistic, that is, focusing on obedience to rules and laws and regulations and the do's and don'ts of religion. We have to distinguish between that and being moral. And one theologian defined being moral this way: being moral, which seeks a blending of rules and boundaries with the dynamic requirement of relationships. I love that. The dynamic requirement of relationships. You see, if we're following the rules but ignoring our neighbors, are we really living into the light that God has called us to? If we're following the rules even to the detriment of our neighbor, we should be asking God how to better understand what he's calling us to. Case in point, Jesus healing on the Sabbath. Good rule, right? Fantastic rule. Sabbath rest, that's an important rule. We need that rest. But to ignore the need of our neighbor for our own good, for our own rest, we'll say, is not being children of the light. Now, this isn't saying you shouldn't rest or you should push yourself so hard to do good for your neighbor that you burn yourself out. But Jesus, I think, perfectly illustrates in healing on the Sabbath that difference between being moralistic, that is following the rules simply in and of themselves, and being moral, that which seeks a blending of the rules with the dynamic relationship requirements. That understanding of how rules and boundaries were always meant for the betterment of our community, for the betterment of ourselves and our neighbor. And the moment that they're not doing that, perhaps we should ask why. So here's the really exciting thing about this passage. Because it shows us glimpses of the possibilities for light in the darkness. And it makes me wonder how we can ask, how is Jesus aglow in each one of us? What does it look like for us, for our church, to live in what one theologian called the chemistry of God's transforming light? The chemistry of God's transforming light. How are we adding ingredients to make that reaction happen? To be a part of that transforming light? And again, the good news is that God brings the light. not us. But how can we let it shine through us? How has God brought the life in your life, and how is he now asking you to shine for others? And I would love for you to tell us, for you to leave a comment or shoot us an email and say, this is how God has brought light to my life, and this is how God has now called me to be light to others. I'm reminded of the times in my life where I have witnessed light transforming darkness, not just shining a light on it or exposing it, but actually transforming that darkness. I think of when I traveled to Haiti in 2017 and saw what was for me probably the darkest place in the world. And yet I watched as the Haitian people sang their guts out to God. I watched them perform acts of love and mercy and kindness and compassion in a place that did everything to work against that. And I saw the ways that they transformed darkness into light. They weren't okay with simply saying, well, here's the darkness. They said, no, we won't let the darkness abide. We will transform it into light. And that's always been a powerful witness to me. I think, too, of my friends incarcerated at Stateville. I think of the ways North Park's program there and the people who are a part of it, our students who are incarcerated, have brought light to a really dark place, but in a way that has transformed it. That by a group of people coming together in beloved community and saying, we are going to be peacemakers, whatever the cost. I have seen a place of darkness begin to transform. I have seen people who years ago greeted us with a scowl or a nasty word now welcome us with a smile. Now ask us to come and be a part of their community. It's been an incredible witness to me. And I think, too, of a time of personal darkness. A few years ago, I got severely injured after falling off a ladder. And my family was just left with so much darkness. I wasn't able to work. And so we had financial woes. I was laid up. My husband was having to do all of the child care for 2 kids, plus care for me as I sat in a bed for months. And what was a really dark time for us was transformed by our church at the time. Our church who brought us so many meals that we didn't have to buy groceries for an entire summer. Our church who constantly prayed for us, called, checked in. Our church who offered to drive me to and from all my physical therapy so that my husband didn't have to take any more time off of work. And my church who showed up in a big way when we got to a point with our finances where we said, God, I don't know how this is going to work, but we know that you are going to provide a way. Friends, light is meant to transform darkness. And so I leave you today again with the question, how has God brought light to your life? And how is he asking you to shine that light for others? Let's continue to ponder on that and ask God to show us how he's called us to be the light of the world, and to thank God for his grace that we don't bring the light, but he always does. Thanks be to God.